Welcome to video number 2, focusing on USA, A Nation in Contrast, the paper from the EDUQAS board. This video is focusing on the presidents and their policies. We're not going to look at President Hoover or President Roosevelt because we looked at them in video number 1 about the Great Depression. So all I'm going to focus on for these presidents is the name of their policy, what that policy actually meant, and some examples of them putting that policy into place. And this could be useful for any kind of describe questions that you may have where you're asked to describe the policies of these presidents. Okay, so let's start with President Truman. Truman was president right after the World War II. President Roosevelt actually dies just before World War II ends, so he never sees the end of it there. Truman takes over in 1945. He is the president that drops the atomic bomb on Japan, which ends the war and effectively starts the Cold War with the Soviet Union, or the USSR, who are a communist country. President Truman's policy is given the name containment. Containment basically means you are containing, which is stopping the spread of communism to other countries. He believed that if one country fell to communism, that the others would fall as well. And this was given the name the domino theory, because if you push one domino, all the others fall too. They kind of had reason for this because the USSR had taken over a lot of countries that were directly next to their border. And they had now become communist countries and given the nickname satellite states. So they did have reason for believing in this policy. So they made sure that any time any country was under the threat of turning communist, that they would step in to help. So some examples of his policy being put into place. It kind of begins with the POTSDAM conference, which is the meeting between the Allies just as World War II is ending to decide what to do about Germany. So in Potsdam, it's England, USSR with Joseph Stalin, who's the leader of the USSR, and America with President Truman. What they decide in Potsdam is what to do now that the war is over, but the reason that the tension is there between Truman and Stalin is because the atomic bomb is about to be dropped, and people know that America have this technology, and Stalin is annoyed because they haven't told USSR and they're supposed to be allies. And Stalin thinks that America haven't told him and Truman hasn't told him because one day they're going to use that atomic bomb against the USSR with a policy of containment to stop communism spreading. So this is where the tension between these two leaders and two countries really starts to kick off, and we have the start of the Cold War. Another example of America using the policy of containment is when they helped Greece out in 1947. Greece was going through various difficulties after World War II, and usually the UK was giving them money and aid, but because the UK were going through difficulties after World War II because of the Blitz and being at war for 6 years, they were not able to help Greece. So America got involved because they believed that if Greece was under hardship, that makes communism a more attractive ideology to follow. So they didn't want Greece to be in that position. So what they did, it was given the nickname the Marshal Plan, and that was basically meant that they would give aid to any country that felt like they needed it to stop them becoming communist. Now this wasn't necessarily military aid to fight communism, it was more things like money, technology and food to help boost their economy and mean that they wouldn't be attracted to communism. So that's what they do in 1947. Probably the most famous example of containment being used is the Berlin crisis in 1948. So in Potsdam and the Yalta meetings, which are the two meetings as World War II are ending, one of the things that's agreed upon is how they should, what they should do with Germany now that the war is over. So what they decide to do is divide Germany into sections. One for Britain, one for the USSR, one for America and one for France. Now America, France and USA are allies, and they're both democratic countries that share capitalist or socialist ideologies. So they kind of merge together, they run the country in the same way, and it's given the name West Germany. USSR has nothing in common with the Allies, so they run their section of East Germany in a communist rule. Another thing that's agreed upon, if you can see in the map there, is Berlin. Berlin is the capital of Germany, and they decide to do the same thing, divide it into 4 sections, give it to the UK, USA, France and USSR. As before, the Allies merged together to create West Berlin, USSR on their own create East Berlin. The thing that's different about Berlin though is it's right smack in the middle of East Germany, which is the area of Germany owned by the USSR. So it's quite hard to get supplies in and out of the Allied section of West Berlin. What Stalin does in 1948 is he cuts off transportation routes to West Berlin, which means that countries like America can't get supplies into the people on their section of Berlin. What they do is they decide to airlift supplies using the planes like you can see in the photograph. The danger was that they thought that Stalin would shoot down the American planes. That would be an act of war, which means that the two countries could then start to fire on one another, no longer being a Cold War, being an actual war. Stalin doesn't fire on the planes, and after a couple of months he lifts the restrictions on transportation, so the airlifts stop. But it's an example of neither country particularly backing down and a Cold War possibly turning into a hot war. So Truman was known for his policy of containment and the fact that he was very harsh and strict against communism and refused to bow down to any communist threats. Okay, let's look at the next president then. President F. Kennedy, or JFK. He became president in 1960 and did not finish his full 4 terms as president as he was assassinated in 1963 and killed. The name of JFK's policy was given the name the New Frontier. It was a phrase that he used a lot during his campaign speeches. He wanted to create a new frontier, a new America, and he wanted the Americans to become, as he said it, new frontiersmen. A new frontier basically means he wanted to make USA a fairer society. He wanted to do that through creating equal rights for Americans, mainly in terms of society, but also in terms of job opportunities and things like that. So some examples of JFK's New Frontier policy was that he appointed a few black judges, including a judge called Thurgood Marshall. This means that he is basically saying that black African Americans should take a larger role in government and particularly in the law. So this showed that he trusted that group of society. He also pushed forward the Civil Rights Act, which unfortunately he would never see passed due to his assassination. He found it very difficult to push this through, as because he was a young president, a lot of members of the government didn't think that he was experienced enough to push forward such a significant act. He also faced a lot of backlash from Southern congressmen and statesmen, obviously because there was segregation in the Southern states. So he found it very hard to get the boost that he needed and the support that he needed for that act. He implemented tax cuts in order to encourage more spending and to boost the economy and to put a bit more relief on the poor. He also invested more money in technology, such as the space program with NASA. He said that he wanted to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, which would actually happen, but obviously JFK would never see that happen. He also started Medicare and Social Security Act. Medicare was basically in order to provide free healthcare or health insurance, so people would pay money in order to get healthcare for free if they ever needed it. And as we know, that's been a very hard thing for any president in America to get support of, especially if you have a lot of insurance companies that make money off medical insurance, so they're reluctant to give that up. Social Security Act of 1962 meant that people were receiving pension and benefits. Each child whose father was unemployed would receive a little bit of money to help them with that, and if you were retired or unemployed, you would receive a bit of money to help you there. So that's an example of JFK's New Frontier. The Vice President of JFK was Lyndon B. Johnson, and when JFK was assassinated in '63, he took over office. He did win the next election and became president up until 1968. His policy name was given the name the Great Society, and it was very similar to the New Frontier of JFK, as they were both Democrats and they both obviously worked together. The Great Society is more tackling poverty than actual civil rights, but he was also wanting to declare war on injustice in general, which would have included civil rights. So, one of the examples of the Great Society taking place is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which Lyndon B. Johnson was able to have passed. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson was a Southern Democrat, so he had support from the Southern states that JFK didn't have. Southern Democrats are given the nickname Dixiecrats, and they're quite hard because they're not as liberal as other Democrats, but they're not as traditional as Republicans. Because he was experienced, and apparently he was quite in your face in the way that he approached people, he was able to win support, and it was passed in 1964, which meant that segregation now needed to come to an end throughout America. He also passed the Voting Rights Act a year later, which meant that African Americans now were able to vote too. He got the Medical Care Act passed as well in 1965. So all the things that basically JFK was trying to pass and was struggling to pass, Lyndon B. Johnson was able to do that. He did suffer some backlash, however. Many Republicans thought he was wasting money on the poor in order to help them. He was accused of doing too little to deal with problems in inner cities. And a lot of his presidency was overshadowed by the fact that it's the 60s where US involvement in the Vietnam War is escalating, and Johnson has to send more troops into Vietnam. And every day on the news, people are getting reports of the atrocities committed in Vietnam, and they are seeing young soldiers' bodies being flown back. Now, Johnson is blamed for that, and blamed for the fact that he can't control the Vietnam War, and he doesn't let the troops come home. So that's kind of one of the things that's overshadowed his presidency. The next president to win the election in 1968 is Republican Richard Nixon. Now, his policy doesn't really have a name, but he did follow an idea of something called détente, which means an ease in tension. So the period of the early 1970s in particular is known as a period of détente, and most of that is because of the work of Richard Nixon. He was a very successful president up until obviously the Watergate scandal that began in 1972 and leads to his resignation in 1974. But let's look at some examples of Nixon trying to create détente, specifically between the USA and the USSR. So he's one of the first presidents to visit a communist country since the Cold War began. So he visits China in 1972 and establishes a really positive relationship there, which means that later on China does get involved in being the mediator between USA and USSR in key issues, such as Vietnam, for example. Nixon also signs the first SALT agreement between USA and USSR, which is a Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And that means that USA and USSR both agree to stop making new nuclear weapons and eventually end up trying to reduce the amount that they're making as well. This is significant because it's the first time that those two countries have actively said we are both going to not build any new weapons because we don't want similar situations like the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 60s. He's also the president responsible for ending the war in Vietnam. He pulls troops out in 1973. He starts to negotiate peace treaty and he signs a peace treaty, eventually bringing an end to the war. Of course, all of this is overshadowed by the Watergate scandal, in which it's revealed that he was spying on the Democratic Party and the Watergate officers were bugged so they could hear what their strategy was. That in itself was dodgy, and then of course he lied about his involvement. He fired people, he basically threw his advisors under the bus in order to protect himself, but of course the Supreme Court ordered for tapes that were recording meetings in the White House. He refused to give up the tapes, and then he gave up edited versions of the tapes, so eventually the tapes were given and the whole thing came out that he had lied and he was doing things that were illegal, and that led to his impeachment, or they tried to impeach him. but he resigns before that can happen. So he kind of leaves in shame, which is a shame in itself, as he did achieve a lot in order to help bring an end to the Cold War. Of course, when USSR invade Afghanistan in 1979, that period of detente comes to an end, and the heat kind of increases just temporarily in the Cold War. Brings us to another Republican president, Ronald Reagan. We're going to skip two presidents, Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. Although they do have some achievements, they don't really have established policies that we're going to look at in a lot of detail. So let's skip to 1981. Ronald Reagan was famously, his policy was given the nickname Reaganomics. Reaganomics basically means trickle-down economics, which is where you cut taxes for the rich and the bigger businesses, and you hope that will eventually trickle down to the poor. Now, if you think about it in terms of a big business, like in our context, Amazon, if you cut the taxes for Amazon, which meant they're paying less taxes, they're now making a bigger profit. That should trickle down so that they're giving more profits to their employers, or they can create more jobs. That should then trickle down to smaller businesses, maybe the businesses that Amazon used to receive goods from, or the postal services. They will then receive the benefits of Amazon making a profit. Then their workers will receive the benefits because there's more jobs created, or they're getting a higher wage than they were before. That should mean that unemployment should go down. That should mean that the government should have to spend less on benefits, such as unemployment benefits, because there are less unemployed people. So that's the general idea of Reaganomics. It takes a long time for it to work, and it didn't particularly work in the 80s in America. So examples of his Reaganomics being put into place is the actual cutting taxes for big businesses, and there's about a wealthy quarter of the population in America, so he's not giving them high taxes either. He also then starts to cut welfare spending in anticipation of it not being needed as much anymore, and he cuts the Medicare bill that were passed by Johnson and JFK. All of this is having a much harsher effect on the poor than the rich. They're getting rid of their benefits and their medical care, and they're not really receiving the trickle-down effects that Reagan wants. Under Reagan, the deficit, which is the gap between how much the government is spending and how much profit they're making, you want your deficit to be small. You don't want to be spending more than you're making. But under Reagan, the deficit becomes larger than the deficit for many presidents that came before him. That's how high the deficit was. So it's not a very successful policy. It's also worth noting that other policies under Reagan, not to do with Reaganomics, is his war on drugs. So he created an Office of National Drug Control in 1988 to try and deal with the drug problem in America in the 80s. He was criticised for not doing much to deal with the emergence of the AIDS epidemic that kind of is brought to light in the 1980s. He's criticised for not doing enough to deal with that, although he does later put money into funding research on how it's caused and how they would cure it. He also escalated the Cold War a little bit more, with Nixon tried to ease tensions because the USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1979. There's an escalation in tension between the two countries. One of the things that Reagan does is he wants to create a Star Wars program, which is a series of satellites and laser guided missiles that meant that if there was a missile launched in the USSR, that they would be able to track it and destroy it before it reached America. It was too expensive to fund, however. Okay, George Bush. He's a Republican president from 1989 to 93. There is no official name for his policies, but there was a famous quote when he was running for president. He said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," which was a promise he made but couldn't fulfill. So he actually increased taxes during his time as presidency because the deficit and the budget needed to be balanced. He reduced the number of wealthy people, however, that were exempt from taxes, so more people that had money were being taxed. He passed the Clean Air Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Most of George Bush's policies, however, do evolve around dealing with Iran and Iraq and the Gulf War. So in 1990, he launches Operation Desert Shield after Iraq invade Kuwait, which is their neighbour, and Saddam Hussein, who is the leader of Iraq, says that it belongs to them, where it doesn't. So America says that they will step in and make sure that this does not happen. So they launch Operation Desert Shield. It's very successful. In a few days, they've managed to take Kuwait back, and the Iraqis have moved back. One of the mistakes he makes, though, is he doesn't then pursue Saddam Hussein. He doesn't depose him as leader of Iraq. This is going to be a problem later on when Saddam Hussein, as a dictatorship, takes over various other parts of Iraq and becomes a real problem for America. This is USA becoming involved in the Gulf War. He also signs the START Treaty in 1990 with the leader of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, and this is bringing about an end to the Cold War. So he's the president that sees the Cold War between USSR and USA come to an end. And then finally, we've got Democrat Bill Clinton, who sees off the rest of the 1990s as president. His policy is given the name Clintonomics. This means he wants to close the deficit, which is the gap between spending and profit, which he does very successfully. There's a very famous picture with the number 0%, which is the deficit. So he manages to close that gap in 1966. One of the ways he does this is by signing the North America Free Trade Agreement, which basically increases trade within America, which helps boost the economy and profit. He sets a minimum wage. He creates the Family and Medical Leave Act, which gives a bit of a boost for American families who are struggling to pay their medical insurance bills. However, as we can see in the picture there, Clinton's presidency is overshadowed by the Lewinsky scandal, where he was accused of having inappropriate relations with intern Monica Lewinsky in the White House. He lies about it. He actually famously quotes, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," on television in front of America. This leads to his impeachment because it's an example of the president lying. However, the impeachment never really comes to pass, and he does remain president until Barack Obama wins later on. Okay, so here are some questions that you can have a go at answering using just the policies of those presidents from the 40s to the 2000s.